compassion as a way of approaching grief. CFT, I think, is really very applicable. I've begun trying to use it. I haven't found a whole lot written. Actually, I found nothing really written on the application of CFT to grief. So I'm kind of going as I go and hoping in this group maybe we can have a good discussion around that. Many of you have a lot more knowledge and practice in CFT. My area of expertise is grief and bereavement. So this might be a really nice way to bridge and to have some discussion and dialogue. So what I thought I would bring to the table is my background in grief and just, kind of give you some ideas of what's current in the research and practice with grief and bereavement. And then how I'm thinking of applying compassion and compassion-focused therapy to grief, and then opening it up to, if you would like to, engage in discussion, or if you have some case studies. I have a couple case studies as well, but this is where I'm really hungering to have a dialogue with people who are immersed into CFT so that I can start applying more of the principles, more of the practice into my work with grief and bereavement. So I am an academic, but my background is clinical, and I still have a clinical practice. I see mostly people with complicated grief and really difficult grief. There's not many people in our area who have that kind of background. So I love working with clients. The academia, I love being with students too, but I really enjoy the client work, and I'll probably always have that. So here you go. So here's what I thought we might kind of try to cover today. Just looking a little bit about some of the current research and theory, just because there's a lot of misunderstandings about what grief actually is and how to approach it. Looking at some of the different types of grief that come about, and then really to focus on a compassionate response and applying CFT to people who are grieving and to our clinical practice. So I'll go through a little bit of background about grief. And I always start with, okay, well, what is grief? That's my academic part. And it's a very broad definition. It's a normal, natural reaction to loss. And we also think of it as an adaptive process. And that's what separates grief from things like depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not something to be treated. I have a very good friend who's a colleague in Wales, and he says, am I treating hunger by eating? And so that's kind of the view, that it's not something to be treated so much as something to be supported, respected, allowed, and it's a different stance. And that's why looking at grief is very different than looking at other issues that might present in a clinical practice. I think it gets pathologized because it's painful, and it really throws us back into a place of struggle. And whenever those of us who are open-hearted, which probably everybody in this group is, seeing someone struggle and seeing someone suffer is hard. Sometimes that's part of the grief, and that's actually some of the adaptive process of the grief, is through the grappling and the suffering that people go through as they deal with their grief. I always thought and think, okay, well, what is a loss? Because we think, okay, well, the death of a loved one is a loss, but there's a lot of other things that we experience in life that is loss. For those of us who've had relationships that have ended, who have had health issues, who've had to move, we know that we've grieved over these things, but I say there's no body, but there is, grief and loss. There doesn't have to be a body there. So I look at this picture of broken glass and think this is a really good image for loss. It means you can't go back. So you could take really nice glue and you could piece back some of these fragments, but this window pane is never going to look the way it did before. And so these are the times in our lives where we know whatever we're now facing, whatever's happened, means we can't go back to being the way we were. Life is not going to be the same. And that's really what I consider to be a loss. You can't go back. Many of you are familiar with attachment theory. We always start with Bowlby and attachment theory. I can remember when I first started in the field, it was like attachment, attachment, attachment. And the thought about attachment and grief has changed some, but the really important point to keep in mind from Bowlby's work is that grief is sort of programmed into us as an adaptive response. It's something that obviously has had some helpful adaptive potential for us because we see it in mammals, we see it in any type of organism that has an attachment system, we see grief. So it must be something that was worth evolutionary value and that we've kind of taken that response with us as we've gone through time. I'm jumping over hordes of all sorts of stuff. If you want background on research and studies, I'm happy to provide it, but I didn't want to bore you guys with that stuff if you didn't find yourselves interested. So whenever I ask people and when I do community talks about grief, they automatically quote Kubler-Ross, you know, the stages of grief. There's a lot of them out there. There's stages, phases, there's tasks of grief, all sorts of things. And I think it's an attempt for many people, both clinicians, researchers, and the average person, to try to make sense of this process. And a lot of these are really pervasive through our culture, but most of them are not empirically validated. And that means that most people don't go through stages, most people don't have phases, or if they do, they're not in a linear progression. So we do know that grief is really variable, and that's what makes it difficult, because sometimes grief presents in ways we don't expect. And in that process, we may be looking at grief, but might be thinking something different if we haven't kind of clued ourselves in. The important thing to keep is that grief is not linear, it's not progressive, it's not something you really can predict. It is what it is. A couple of pieces of research that have turned things on their feet about how we view grief. The first was the continuing bonds theory, came out in the mid-1990s. What was interesting, it came from a group of researchers at Harvard and a group of researchers in Israel at the same time doing similar research, looking at people who were bereaved. And they realized that most people who are bereaved of a loved one still continue a relationship with that person who died. They have a sense of their presence, they may talk to them, they may have a sense of them guiding things, but that relationship really does continue. So if the earlier thinking was that grief is the result of a broken attachment bond, that's not going to fly, because the bond actually doesn't get broken. What happens is the bond is replaced from a physical bond to more of an intangible one, but a very strong one nonetheless. So this is the quote, "Death ends a life, but not a relationship." And so in my work and practice with my clients, a lot of what I do is try to reconnect them to either the lost person and their memory, so that they have an internal relationship that continues with them, or to a previous version of themselves that they can connect to walk up to how they got to where they are right now. So this is if you Google this, "A Thought of You" by Ryan Woodard, it's a beautiful little video that he did, and it's a very nice example of continuing bonds. So if you have time, you want to look at it, you can. I'm going to send the slide deck to Greg, and I think, Greg, are you recording right now? I couldn't remember if you were, but anyway, so I'm going to send this to Greg. And so if you want to look over it and kind of delve in more, you're welcome to do so. I do remember when I first started into therapy work, we talked about recovering from grief or resolving grief, some form of resolution, and we just don't use that language anymore, because people we know will actually grieve a significant loss for the rest of their lives in some way, shape, or form. Maybe anniversary times, reminders, bittersweet moments. So we know that the grief really doesn't end in the way we used to think it did. And this goes into something we call the grief work myth. This was the work of a group of researchers from the Netherlands who did a ton of research with people who were bereaved of all different types of losses. And I remember being told this, that, you know, you've got to get people to talk, you've got to get people to really emote. And the goal of the grief was to get them to disengage from all that energy they had wrapped around the person who died. And the research that's come out really says that neither of these statements is true, that not everybody needs to talk about it, not everybody needs to emote, not everybody will grieve in their emotions. And actually, it's just the opposite now. I always talk about you move through grief and move forward by finding a way to hold on so that you can move on. I'm sorry, I didn't have a way of minimizing that automatic notification. I'll just keep getting if they come up. So this is a really important piece for those of us who did therapy work, because you'll find clients that come in and they'll talk about having somatic issues. So, you know, they'll talk about having headaches and backaches or stomach aches. They'll talk about accidents and injuries that they'll have. I had one bereaved client that had broken both her elbow and her knee within a year after the loss of a very significant mentoring figure, but she never really emoted. For her, a lot of her grief was very cognitive, but also somatic. So we know that people just grieve differently. Some of the research that came out actually in the late 90s indicated that grief counseling, grief therapy can be harmful to people. And of course, that was a big outcry. The harm was when people were mandated into grief counseling. They were kind of told they needed to go, like some of the programs in hospice that had a year of bereavement follow-up, and they really encouraged people to go to the groups, but maybe that wasn't what they needed to do. I get a lot of calls from adult children who have lost a parent, that the other parent is not grieving properly, or they're worried about that parent. And sometimes they'll come in and talk with me and feel better just normalizing what they're seeing and talking about the loss of the other parent now, because that other parent is different. So, and this is the other piece of, I think, the research that's more important. This was also from originally Stroba et al., and I've adapted it to non-death loss and grief, as well as bereavement-related grief. That, you know, grief, we talk about, in a minute, we'll talk about how the process of grief is about our shattered assumptive world, but you don't spend all of your time over here in grief. So all of this is very poignant, but you'll then have to, you know, you'll go from being overwhelmed by the changes and the loss and the way your life has changed to having to pay the bills, or having to take the kids to soccer, or actually going to a movie and laughing at the movie, and then coming back home and the house is empty and you're once again back into here with the reminders of loss. Most people oscillate what they call back and forth between all of these things on a regular basis in the process of their grief, even in acute raw grief. So it's normal to see this. When you have attachment difficulties, it will skew some of this. I don't have time to get into it, but when there are people who have attachment difficulties, they might tend to stay more into this area or this area, depending upon if they're more avoidant or if they're more anxiously ambivalent. It's just a nice visual diagram to think about grief, I think. Okay. So Ronnie Janet Bowman put out a book in the early 90s called Shattered Assumptions. And this book actually looked at her view of trauma, but in looking at how she wrote about the assumptive world, it really applies to grief. Colin Murray Parks is a big leader in our field. He actually studied with Bowlby. He did a big study of widows in the UK and was one of the first studies of grief and bereavement. And he really was looking at the attachment system and how that was formed in people and how that kind of related to their grief. And then Ronnie Janet Bowman took the concept of the assumptive world and said, it's our assumptions about the world and how the world should be is actually part of our attachment system. And then my work in non-death loss and grief, I actually see the attachment system mediates how we grieve in all kinds of losses. And so that's something in therapy, as you work with attachment issues with your clients, can be very useful in grief and bereavement as well. Okay. So this is the assumptive world. I think this is really the basic construct for grief. And you know, each of us has a way of seeing the world and how we expect things to happen. It really allows us to have a sense of predictability and consistency. It's what made us get up this morning and think about, am I going to have coffee, tea? You know, I was going to get in the car. We don't expect to get into a car crash. We don't expect, because our assumptive world allows us to have some sense of safety and predictability. And it's really something that we formed when we were very young. And not everybody's assumptive world is built on the world being a great place. It's just whatever keeps you in a sense of feeling safe and predictable is the key here for that. So it's really three aspects. It's how we expect things to happen. It's how we assume other people will be towards us and in the world. And it's also how we tend to view ourselves. And I think this is a really helpful way of looking at grief and loss. So this is another way of kind of looking at it. When Ronnie Janet Bowman did her view of the assumptive world, she actually put in things about this that she felt everybody had, including a view of the world as a good place, a sense of intrinsic worth and value. In my work, I haven't necessarily seen that across the board. So that's where I kind of broadened these categories a little bit. So my students, and when I'm doing workshops, I'll have people write these things down, because we don't really think about our assumptive world unless it's been shattered or crushed. We really, most of the time, don't think about these things that often. The second one is really important. You'll hear, why did this have to happen? Why did this have to happen to her? I've worked a lot with infertile couples going through treatment, and they'll see someone on the street with a baby who obviously has no desire to really have this baby, and here they are spending their life savings and all of their energy trying to have a baby, and this is a big piece for them. So you'll hear these things. You'll hear, who am I now? I don't know what to do with myself. I feel lost. And these are all things that apply to our assumptive world, and how our world is kind of working around until we hit a major loss experience. So these might be examples. These are examples that Ronnie Janoff Bowman gave. And I'd say a good portion of people really, kind of are in line with some of these examples, but it's just they're examples of how, these things get viewed and get changed when there's grief. A piece down here, when I've worked with the couples going through infertility treatment, often the woman especially, she'll say, I always viewed myself as a mother, and I don't know how to view myself now if I'm not going to be a mother. So that cues me in to tap into, that's a very core place for her. So I think it's all loss experiences. It's all these experiences that bump up against our assumptive world. This is the mechanism of grief. I think when our world is shattered by something that we have to go through. And this is, I think, what triggers the grief response. I think when our assumptive world is actually shattered or rendered not meaningful, then that's what triggers our grief, that particular piece. So it could be the loss of a loved one, and very likely for many people it is, but it could be the loss of a marriage. It could be the loss of a relationship. It could be the loss of a time in life. So you really have to think broadly about this loss experience. And I think why this is important is we're looking at the healthy response to some very difficult conditions that aren't necessarily treatable, but are still very painful and still require a lot of support from those around the person who's gone through them. Okay. So we talk a lot about relearning the world. We talk about how to be and act in a world that's different now. A big process of grief is really how to relearn how to be in the world again. It's rebuilding our world. It's relearning how to be in the world that's different now than what we thought it was going to be. That's the grieving process. Notice that the work of grief is a really an adaptive, healthy piece of work. I think we see the surface where people are really struggling and really mired down in their grief and pain, but that doesn't mean it's not doing some adaptive work as well. And this is the piece that I always go to, that sometimes what dies is what's inside of us. You think about some of my clients and they'll describe a loss of innocence or a loss of hope, sometimes a loss of themselves. And I listen for what I call the language of loss, because that's telling me where to zero in terms of support, in terms of validation, and in terms of recognition of a significant event that's happened or process that's occurring. So this is kind of the version of grief. It's the process by which we reconcile the world that we now know exists with the world we once believed to exist. So you think about how we kind of protect ourselves with some of our beliefs. Well, you'll look and see somebody got lung cancer. Well, I can't get lung cancer because I don't smoke. But what happens if you do get lung cancer and you never were a smoker? Well, then you go back to that's not fair because that wasn't supposed to happen. These are defenses that we have that protect us. They're part of our assumptive world. When these defenses and these beliefs don't make sense anymore, this is where grief kind of kicks in. And it's that process of having to reconcile now this has happened, this shouldn't have happened, but it's here with what I thought the world was going to be. I have a colleague who's a dermatologist. I get to go in every year to have my slice and dice therapy with her. I'm from Florida, so I had a lot of sun exposure. But she talked to me about her daughter who was in a car crash when she was 17 and had an acquired brain injury. And it left her unable to process things, and it left her unable to finish school. And down a path of one thing led into another until she began using drugs and substances. And now when her daughter shows up at the house, she locks everything up because her daughter will steal from her to support her addiction. And her daughter won't engage in discussions with her and doesn't keep up with her. And so one of the things she told me is that I feel like I've lost her. She's there, but she's not my daughter anymore. And I feel like I've already lost her, but she's still alive. And that's a big piece of her grief. So the big process, I think, in grief, what grief actually makes us do is to find ways to have meaning again in our world. And it's not the why did this happen, but okay, well, now what? Now what is my life? Now what am I supposed to do? Now what do I think about things? And sometimes people can help foster the meaning making through talking and through remembering and rituals. It's important that, you know, we have a ritual for people who have died with the funeral and some of the after experiences, but we don't for a divorce necessarily, and we don't necessarily for a loss of a job or things that can be very significant, but they don't have ways of attaching meaning very easily. And these are places that are really deep, a part of who we are. I mean, the work that we do and how we identify ourselves, you know, think if that was no longer possible. Many of you are familiar with the practice of kintsugi, which is when you take a broken vessel and you magnify the breaks by putting gold flecking into the glue. It's a lovely tradition. And this is kind of what the grieving process involves. That somehow we have to put back together this vessel so it can hold water again. And we recognize now that the cracks are actually bringing some form of beauty and growth for us, but not while it's still broken. Okay. So I think grief serves a valuable purpose. It's something that does help us to heal. We're so used to wanting people to feel better that we forget that sometimes they can't, and sometimes that's really not reasonable to expect. So I think a lot of working in grief is knowing how to be fully present, is knowing how to sit with some real intense stuff, and how to normalize some of these things that people may have never felt before, experienced before, and now it's right up front and center in their lives. But it's important to keep in mind, it's the adaptive process, and that's what differentiates us from working with somebody who's maybe depressed or dealing with another form of disorder that actually needs a different type of approach, or maybe an approach and plus. So that's the first part. The second part of grief I go into, and this was huge for me. I wasn't really trained in this a lot in my clinical work and my training, but to look at when someone comes in, that we always think of grief as being an individual problem, but really I think we've made it into a much more social issue than we realize, because a lot of how we grieve and the context of our grieving is determined by the responses of the people around us, and how socially we're trained to think about vulnerability and pain and emotions. So most Western-oriented industrial societies are very focused on being efficient, you know, the consumerism, the materialism, and it really influences how our reactions are perceived and how we see ourselves and our reactions. So experiences that have a lot of emotional content tend to be dismissed because emotions are seen as weak, or they're seen as something to apologize for. I always do this with my students. Somebody comes up to you and shares something very painful and they start to cry. You know, often what they'll say to you in their pain is, "I'm so sorry." It's like, you know, we've trained ourselves to be sorry when we're emotionally not connected in a way that suppresses it or that pushes it down. When we show that vulnerability in our emotions, we're taught that that's embarrassing. We're taught that we've made somebody else uncomfortable. And so people who struggle with really heavy, intense emotions in their grief often get these messages. They get the, well, at least this, or if only that. And I think people mean well, but it doesn't necessarily serve them well. A big concept in the field is something called disenfranchised grief. This was originally a concept developed by Kenneth Doka. And this is a really important place because it determines, number one, how a person will be able to receive support in their grief, but also how they might view themselves as well, because we all have this internalized and we'll compare ourselves up internally to these. Well, it was just a dog. Well, that dog might have been the most wonderful, faithful companion to you and actually been closer to you than any other person in your life right now, but it was just a dog, or you can replace it. You think about miscarriage, well, you never held that baby. And so there's this real sense of diminishing and dismissing certain types of lost experiences. And really the only person who knows how significant a loss has been is that person, not somebody else. But that's not what happens when we go out into the bigger world. So the context, a relationship might not have been recognized. This happens in extramarital affairs, in relationships that maybe are under the table. I counseled one young woman who had been involved with one of her professors, and he died suddenly, and she was left not being able to grieve with anybody because she couldn't tell anybody about that relationship. The loss may not be acknowledged. The griever's not recognized. You're not family, but you might have been closer to that person than their family. Situations where there's disenfranchisement, that might be suicide, homicide, places where there's a certain lifestyle attributed to the loss, or the ways that individuals grieve. So probably the most disenfranchised grievers in my practice are women who tend to grieve more cognitively, not through their emotions, and men who do grieve through their emotions and who really want to talk to people about how they're feeling. So we have these social rules about grief, how long it should last, what it should look like, how to express your grief in socially acceptable ways. And the hard part is that, we have all this internalized, but grief isn't necessarily listening. Grief isn't determined by these boundaries. And so this is where often people will come into therapy because they don't have the validation or the support that they really need to do the grief that they need to do. They keep having to package it in ways so that they're able to function in their social circles, or they isolate themselves because it's too painful to know that you're disappointing someone, or they may be even judging you. So it's a big piece around grief that I deal with a lot. I think the social rules exist because we want to control what's threatening. When somebody is emoting in front of us or in the workplace, everybody's uncomfortable, they all scatter because we've never been taught when we were young how to be with people who were in emotions and crying. So I think what happens is if we can abide by the social rules, they'll keep us from feeling socially excluded from the people around us, so we don't have another loss on top of the people who can't be with us. So I think we also feel this pressure to just keep functioning no matter what. And I see this at the university. I see this all over the place that, well, you should be able to go back to work, or you get the 3 days of funeral leave, that should be enough. Nobody ever asks the person who's grieving what they really need. A lot of times they aren't able to say because they don't have permission themselves as well. So I think what happens is we're such social creatures. There's actually some research called the social pain theory, where the pain of exclusion or not belonging is felt actually physically to us. The concept of shame and what that does to us comes up very prominently when people are feeling vulnerable when they're in grief. I put this down, this comment, this is highly inconvenient. It was a client that I was working with. She works at Western. She's a very brilliant, bright person. And she tends to be in her head a lot, and that's just where her comfort zone is. But there was one time she was crossing the border, and when the border guard asked her where she was going to Ohio to visit her husband's family. Her husband had died. And he just said, why are you going? Where are you going? And she burst into tears in front of this border guard and was humiliated that she did that. And she said, it's the fastest way to get through the border is to do something like that. She said he could hardly wait for me to drive through his booth. But she said, this is really inconvenient. And I thought that was really funny. Grief is highly inconvenient. So I thought it was kind of funny. So it's really hard when we're feeling things that are emotionally intense, and there's social messages that say you need to contain and manage your emotions and be functional. You know, I think we look at what's right about what's wrong, and I don't think these social rules and these social messages are serving us quite very well. So this is an MC Escher print. I think if you were to ask people who are in acute grief, this is kind of what it feels like. But, you know, I think high social value, we place a lot on people being able to be strong and stoic, and to shape their grief in ways that make everybody else around them comfortable, but in ways that may not be best for them. So I think experiences that make it difficult to access our intellect, that make it hard for us to be, you know, in control, are threatening. And I think that's a big piece of why we have these social rules and why they play so prominently in grief. So this came from a book that I read. I loved it. What's right about what's wrong. So I had a gentleman that came in. His wife of 35 years had died. They were very, very close. He was a school teacher. He was a high school teacher. He had taken off the last 6 months of her life to be her caregiver. And when she died, he was absolutely devastated. And it's hard for him to come to the house. He couldn't sleep in the bedroom because he would always feel her absence. He always had the TV on. And it's interesting, he came in to talk with me in his first session. He sat down and he said, I have got to stop wallowing in my self-pity. I need you to help me to get out of this. So I remember thinking, you've come to the wrong place. But I started thinking, you know, well, what's right about what's wrong here? And so I asked him the question. He looked at me like, that's not why I'm here. But eventually he really did come to a place of being able to open to his grief and why his grief was so pronounced, which made sense, really. There is a form of grief. We're seeing a lot more research on it right now, really in the last 5 years even, called, and depends on the DSM or the ICD-11, which one you're looking at. The DSM calls it persistent complex bereavement disorder. It's a big mouthful. It's not an actual disorder, it's for further study. The ICD-11 actually did talk about prolonged grief disorder, and they do have it listed as a diagnosable condition. There's a lot of controversy around this, but it's about 10 to, I'd say 12 to 15% of grief people have these really severe grief reactions where they just can't function. These are people that really, really struggle. So they might actually get worse over time instead of better. They might not be able to shower. They might not be able to get their food or eat. They tend to have more medical disorders, sometimes with higher morbidity and mortality rates, more suicidality, and functional disability. So this is a group of people that we want to be able to catch, that maybe they wouldn't be best served by going to a grassroots grief support group. Maybe these are the people that would really benefit from coming into therapy to do some work around their grief. I think it's really funny. In the last 5 years, probably 95% of the research in grief has been on this complicated grief, but 85% of the people who are grieving don't have this. But it's because we focus on what's, you know, the diagnosable conditions. DSM-5 actually in the last rendition removed something called the bereavement exclusion off of major depressive disorder. So that opens up people who are now bereaved to be prescribed antidepressants. And that's been a big controversy as well. I'll kind of distinguish between depression and grief. I don't know if you can see this clearly on your screen, and I've got you guys pictures here, so I'm working around it. And my cat has managed to come up on my table, but he's being quiet. So he'll be my co-facilitator here. So if we look at the difference between depression and grief, one thing that's interesting is that as Bowlby described grief as he saw it, it was more of a form of separation distress, which would actually be closer to anxiety than it would be to depression. I think the exhaustion that comes with grief is often mistaken for depression. And this is what I'm listening for. We know depression presents often with a lack of energy, lack of engagement, and people have difficulty functioning. We know that people who are grieving can have that as well. But the lack of energy comes from a different place. It's because they're constantly bombarded with the need to accommodate, they're coping, trying to adjust to the loss, and that's what causes the symptoms. It's something different than what's at the core of depression. People who are depressed, often their symptoms can be diffuse, they can be long-lasting, and they really often can't pinpoint it to an event. Very rarely it's an event that this happened and now I've been depressed ever since. In grief, usually they can relate it to an event or a series of events that have occurred that have really shattered their assumptive world. And sometimes they're so tired of having to accommodate. Often people who've had one loss after another, or in succession will experience that. In depression, often it can be temporary, it can improve over time. The grief will last as long as there's a need to accommodate to the loss. Any of the disparities, the symptoms that are seen in grief are really as a result of the loss that's happened. And the key down here, I've had places where we've talked about this for a long time about medication and grief. In depression, it may really be responsive to medication. We know that. In grief, it's an iffy thing. Medication may help people if they're not sleeping. It may help people if they really need to control their emotions more, because sometimes people will say it helps them to feel a little bit more regulated emotionally. But for some, the medication may actually worsen or prolong the grief. So it's a real judgment call. I typically talk to my clients if they're not sleeping, if they're really struggling with functionality and they have to function. I will suggest they talk with their doctor about their symptoms and see what the doctor suggests. And I leave it at that, knowing that it's going to be a dialogue down the road. I think it's interesting, you'll talk with people who are grieving and they'll say, I feel like I'm going nuts. I feel like I can't function. I don't know who I am anymore. And the key piece of this is, the grieving process is centered around, losing control over over what happens to the people and the things we value the most in our lives. So of course, we're going to feel powerless and helpless and confused. And of course, we live in a society that doesn't know how to deal with us when we're feeling helpless and confused, other than trying to fix it. So when a referral to someone who does grief therapy or someone who really knows how to do this work might be indicated, would be kind of these things, more than a grassroots. There's a lot of really good grassroots supports. I know in Toronto there is, London we have quite a bit. I actually did kind of a survey across Ontario to see what communities had different kind of grief support. And most people really just need somebody who will be there with them, to listen, to allow the grief to be there, to offer that kind of support without trying to fix. But like I said earlier about the complicated grief, there might be times when people really do need access to a therapist and someone who understands what's happening. And these are the people that I would tend to look towards for referrals. Okay. So I'll switch over. So, okay, here's the thing about grief. That's in the nutshell version. So this is a little bit, this is basic for this group. You guys all probably have this down. But I always think of Paul Gilbert's work of talking about compassion being something courageous. And it's a courageous act to be compassionate, to actually, be in the presence of someone who's really hurting and to not look away and to not try to shut it down or try to fix it right away. I think that's an act of courage for the people around individuals who are really suffering. So why compassion? This is what I shared a little bit at the beginning. I think it's a way of being with ourselves and others when we know there's pain that can't be relieved. And you're going to find a lot of that with people who are grieving. You can't fix this. You can't reverse time. You can't make it better. There's no answer. And it challenges us as helpers, to step away from that, I need to make this better, to I need to be able to sit with this in a very real and engaged way. So I think compassion normalizes that we all share the same human condition, meaning we will all grieve at different times in our lives. There's no difference in that. And I think that piece of the social context about the shameful experience of losing control or of having emotions or feeling weak or not functional, and all the shaming messages around that are really addressed well by the concept of self-compassion and being compassionate towards someone who's suffering and not adding to that suffering. So if you have the stance of compassion, it allows for suffering to be present. If you know that part of life is going to involve suffering, then there's a way of being able to sustain that focus and sustain a way of being with people, that you don't have to go do a timeout, that you don't start feeling your own distress, because you recognize that and you know how to sit with it in a very compassionate way with yourself and with the person who's with you. I attended the Being with Dying training at the Upaya Zen Center. I've done the Grace training at the same place. That was one of the places I really opened to looking at compassion and what it involves and how we actually can cultivate compassion in our practices. When I was at the Upaya Zen Center, this was their focus, was that compassion training consisted of cultivating mindful awareness, learning how to be fully present, and being able to attune, to ourselves and to the people around us, to our environment. And then the loving kindness practice of being aware of our own suffering, and the awareness of others' suffering, and desire to relieve that suffering with the recognition not all suffering can be relieved. That it's not a therapeutic failure if I don't relieve somebody's suffering or they don't feel better. I tell some of my clients they might actually feel worse for a little bit after they see me, because we open Pandora's box. We look and dig around in all the muck, but we do it together. And sometimes that really feels hard and difficult, but there's a certain sense of, I got that, I did that. I actually was able to look at that now. And in some of my clients, that takes a long time, but the capacity to be able to do that work, I think the compassion training is perfect. It's something that I draw upon on a daily basis. So if you get into what I call the helper mentality, I know my first original work was in nursing. We had the nursing process. It's a process of being very active. So you assess, and then you make a plan for how you're going to address the issues. And then you intervene, and then you evaluate if what you did for your intervention was actually appropriate. There's not a whole lot there that talks about being with. It's about doing to. And I think the capacity of compassion and being aware means that sometimes we understand there's not a reason to fix. We just need to be with this for a bit. We need to actually be fully present to it. And without that capacity of being aware and having that mindfulness and awareness, that's a lot harder. I don't think it's really possible to do that adequately with people who are really hurting. Sorry about the animations here. When we talk about the therapist's use of self, this is something I draw upon a lot, because I think we can all have different kinds of training. It's more of a training ourselves inside our practice and how we encounter ourselves in clients. I think that's our use of self. That's the piece that becomes more developed. So we can be more fully present if we know how to be grounded, if we know what that feels like. Sometimes I'll have a client in front of me who's really struggling and really emoting, really in a lot of pain. And inside I'll think, I wish you peace. I'm here with you. I'm breathing with you. You are not alone. And those are things that I can say inside. I don't always say them outside because they sound a little weird to the average person, but it's my intention, it's my motivation, it's my presence very consciously with that person. So here's Paul. We know Paul. Hi, Paul. So I think I was really drawn to compassion-focused therapy, number one, because it is about therapy, and a lot of the other research in compassion has to do with healthcare, which is appropriate, but not always applicable to my clients and what I'm dealing with my clients. And I really think Paul and all the descriptions and the discussions, it's so rich and useful. So I also think that because CFT originates from the same idea that grief and bereavement theory does, in terms of looking at a ethology of existence and how we have evolved with certain things in our lives and certain ways of being. I think that it fits very nicely with grief. the attributes of compassion. I didn't put up this big slide here, but I think each one of these has something to offer for the clients that we have in our practices who are grieving. I can sit here and sit with each one of these and know how they would be useful and how they would be helpful to work with clients who are really struggling with grief and pain. It took me a while to get this just right with the diagram. Paul actually looked at it and said, no, do this, no, do that. And I think I finally got it. This is the affect regulation system as proposed in CFT. I think it's a great visual. I actually looked at it and thought, oh, this makes so much sense. This is really helpful. And I use it towards grief because I think a significant loss would go back to that attachment system, our assumptive world. Significant losses make us go into that place of threat. We feel defensive, we're vulnerable, and that's that threat, the fight-flight place. And so that threat system is really meant to protect us here. It's really safety seeking, and it's a protective system, but we can't stay there for a long time and try to find our healing. So I think the gist of where I'm coming at with CFT is that the therapeutic relationship can act as a link into the soothing system for people who are grieving, opening the door for connection that feels safe and for healing, what I call the attachment wound that's been created either by the loss of a loved one or a significant loss in our lives. And that's where I see the bridging for CFT. I'll just throw this up there. I always think it's so pretty, but it's a little complicated. This is Roshi Joan Halifax's model of enactive compassion. I actually did a comparison of her look at compassion with Paul's, and they may be drawn differently, but they're really drawing upon very similar things. So she talks about the components of compassion being the ability to regulate affect, the ability to have discernment, to be aware, to be attuned, and to focus. And she talks about being able to focus without looking away. And we all kind of know what that feeling is. Interestingly, the time that was hardest for me, it's not been when I've had a client come and talk about the loss of a loved one or a significant experience. I had a client that came in and talked about her daughter and her relationship that was fractured when she accidentally killed her daughter's kitten. And then she went into detail to describe how that happened. I could not get it out of my mind. So it's interesting, my own vulnerability, because I love animals, I really had to go and process that and really sit with that for a while to regroup after that session. So we can't remove the cause of suffering. If we're alive, we're going to have grief and we're going to have loss. Those of us who are therapists and clinicians, I think the first part is that we bear witness to people's pain and not try to change it or fix it first. We call it a companioning model, that we're journeying alongside people who are grieving. We're not trying to shift them per se as much as we start by walking alongside them. By learning how to be present and to be aware when some of my own conditioning comes up and to recognize when it does so that I can say, I see that, thank you, and then put it on the shelf for now because it's not something I need. I don't think compassion can be seen as a passive process. I think a lot of people misunderstand. You guys would be aware of this because of the work that you do. And I'll skip because there's a slide that this is something that came to me as I was doing the Being with Dying training, this idea of yin and yang of compassion, that sometimes compassion is more of a quiet, reflective process. We're bearing witness, we're focusing our attention, we're being very present. But I think sometimes compassion is really about advocating and being protective. I think about children who are in abusive situations. The act of compassion is to protect them, right? We talk about active engagement and fierce compassion. I think they're both a part of the bigger picture of what is compassion. So to me, in grief, this is really where I draw upon the ability to focus attention and stay fully present with myself and with my clients in great difficulty and a lot of intensity. And then being able to keep my emotional balance to help stabilize clients. They come into my office and it feels safe. And it also feels like there's a container that they can trust. I don't need to shut clients down, hopefully, because I can tolerate the distress without having to rush in there. I understand that suffering is part of the human condition. And while I want to relieve suffering, and recognize suffering. Not all suffering can be, which is the bigger picture perspective. What I think is key, Paul will talk about compassion as a motivation. Roshi will talk about compassion as an intention. Both ways of looking at it have to do with your stance and how you're in the situation versus the outcome and what happens after that. It's really more about our motivation to relieve suffering, our desire to be a healing presence. And if something good comes of that as an outcome, that's great, but that's not where I'm going to focus because I can't control that. And I think that's a big piece, because if we get focused on people have to feel better and they have to respond in certain ways, then we really get taken off track of that process of grief that really needs to unfold versus outcome measures that so many of the insurance companies want us to be able to document, which I do with my clients. I say, okay, what do you want me to put down for this? And we will do that together. I love this. This was from the 365 Days of Compassion a few weeks ago from Dennis Turch. He always comes up with some really nice ways of saying some very pithy things. Being present sounds nice, but it's definitely not for the faint of heart. I agree. Being in the moment can be blissful, but many times involves holding suffering, ours or others, inside our awareness without turning away in fear or aversion. And I love, that's really hard to do. This is, to me, grief therapy in a nutshell. It's really, and it's funny, I showed this to some of my students. They all said, this is fantastic, it's perfect. And it just is such a nutshell of this is grief, and this is what we do with grief. So I think the applications of CFT for grief and bereavement is that it enhances our ability to attune to clients and ourselves, the ability to stay present even when it's really hard, to really acknowledge and recognize that even while we want to relieve suffering, not all suffering and pain can be relieved. We also look at the norms and expectations that cause shame and grieving. I think Kristen Neff's work around self-compassion has been really helpful. A lot of my clients, I send them to her site for the practices and also for the self-compassion test that she has there, just so they get an idea of, oh, okay. And I think that focus on our motivation relieves the pressure to do something to make the grieving person better instead of to journey alongside someone as they're in a very difficult place. Okay. So I think it's a reciprocal. I think we look at our own selves and our compassion with ourselves, and we then are able to extend that compassion to those in our care, those we wish to serve. So it's not that we can't do anything, it's that we need to be more, be present. And then if there's something to do, it comes up from that place instead of a doing as a way of avoiding and averting our focus from being with the pain. So this is the shame piece that I think the compassion is so helpful with my clients. I think this, what's right about what's wrong is a really powerful question. Well, what's right about what's wrong here? And that need for people to feel like they have to be strong at a time when, who says that? And really it's much more humane to just be with us and to know that sometimes we can't be that and it's okay. So Mary Vachon and I wrote a chapter together about the liberating capacity of compassion. It was in a social justice book that I edited with Teshel Border, looking at those of us who do this work actually being liberators in a way, that we, in the compassionate focus, liberate our clients and ourselves from this need to constantly be productive and functional and efficient, to being human and to being present. And there's so much to be said for this, but it makes such a huge difference, I think, to be able to do this work and have that stance. Something that I work with my clients sometimes is learning a new language of compassion with their grief. These are all statements on the left of what I've had clients say to me. So I feel so stupid right now, to maybe sometimes my grief really makes it hard to focus. A client I talked to you about with his wife who died, I need to stop wallowing in self-pity. And instead it became, my grief reminds me of how much I've really lost. I hate feeling so weak. I'll hear that a lot, but how I'm feeling makes sense given what's happened. I just need to get a grip and get over this. I'm doing my best given the circumstances. And that's a way of, I think, actively working with compassion with people who are grieving. Okay. So this is where we're not trying to change, we're trying to be with. So we normalize what's happening. We support and listen without comparing and interrupting. We validate the grief, and we really address the impact of the social stigma and rules on people who are grieving in their own healthy way, but maybe not according to social norms and rules. And that's what I had. So that's kind of where I came from.